Yeah, I'm a graduate of the Ecology Center. So 13 years ago next month, I defended my thesis right up here. So it's kind of fun to be back. Okay, what I'd like to do today is tell you a story about a GIS tool that this team of folks from the Nature Conservancy has been developing, or has developed and is continuing to develop. This is a tool for trying to identify strategic locations for fuel breaks in sagebrush steppe, with an eye toward installing these fuel breaks in a way that we can be efficient in our treatments to benefit sage-grouse and other species. Louis, Bob, Tanya, and Brad, these are other scientists with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a global nonprofit conservation organization. One of the things we really pride ourselves on is that of our 3,600 staff around the world, about 600 of them are scientists. We are a science-driven group. And this last name up here, Brad McCrae, some of you might be familiar with some of his work. He actually developed the circuitscape model that I'll be talking about. Also, I want to emphasize the word experimental on this slide. What I'm going to talk about today is a GIS tool that is in development. And when I say experimental, I mean it's something that we continue to work on and really needs to be tested. Greater sage-grouse need these large interconnected expanses of sagebrush. And at least in the western portion of the species range, wildfire really is a primary threat to this species. But there aren't a lot of options for really preventing these large wildfires that are so characteristic of largely the Great Basin these days. We're coming across a lot of policy documents that really talk about the need for the development of tools for protecting this habitat. And so I just want to show a couple examples from some policy statements that really pull out the need to develop these tools for taking a big picture look, looking at really large landscapes to identify strategic locations for doing different sorts of fuel treatments, for example. And of course, early this year, we also have the secretarial order from Secretary Jewell about really the need to do something about large wildfires as a way to protect sage-grouse, conserve sage-grouse as well as its habitat. So what we decided to do was to use sort of a novel approach, modeling approach, for trying to identify these strategic locations across really large spatial extents. So this is a GIS tool. What I'm going to do through the remainder of this presentation is really go through the steps in this tool, sort of let you look under the hood and see what the inputs are to the model, talk a little bit about how it works, how we can interpret the outputs, and then what's next for this process. One of the things I will be able to do today is also just talk about some of the general recommendations that we've made about what might come next and where we might want to focus some of our efforts. So these are the two sage-grouse population areas that we use to define our study area, both the Northern Great Basin and the Box Elder population areas. We refer to this project area as the duck. It's a long story, but I will refer to the duck through this presentation as I refer to different parts of its body. Its head is there. And you can see the primary, land manager in this landscape is the BLM. We've already seen different versions of this slide. In this case, I'm just showing the estimated fire perimeters for fires between 2000 and 2014 in this landscape. And so you can see the number and size of a lot of the fires that have burned inside the duck. So Circuitscape it's a computer model, and some of you might be familiar with it because it's really been popularized as another tool for modeling wildlife corridors. One of its real strengths is that rather than just identifying the single best corridor between two, say, habitat preserves, something like that, it actually can give you many responses. I mean, it can find many solutions. It can find all the different solutions. So our team thought that perhaps there was an opportunity to use CircuitScape also to model fire. This is a new idea. There's not much in the literature about it yet, but I'll go through and explain what we did. So this is we're not modeling fire likelihood. I want to get that out of the way. What we really try to do is simulate what we're calling either wildfire transmission or fuel break potential. And I'll get into those terms more a little bit later. This CircuitScape model basically it's an electrical circuit model. And so the way you can think about it is what I'll be doing is drawing analogies between sort of electrical theory as well as fire. Okay, so I'll be trying to identify analogs between those two worlds. So the main inputs for the model, and there are 3 of them, and all of these inputs are rasters. And what that means is that across this landscape, these 27 million acres, it's been broken into lots of cells, and each cell is 90 meters on a side. Okay, so the first input is the sources. That's where we inject electrical current into the landscape. Okay? Second, we have grounds. Those are places on the landscape where we're going to let that electricity leave the landscape. The third input is a resistant surface. And what that is basically a flammability index raster. So every pixel in that landscape gets a value, an index, that's a measure of how flammable it might be. And then by running the model, what we're able to do is identify pinch points in the landscape. So places where current tends to concentrate as it flows across the landscape. And so our idea is that those are locations where it might be more efficient to install fuel breaks. And something we did besides identifying potential locations is we also came up with a way that we can actually insert an artificial fuel break into the landscape and then run a simulation and get a sense of how an artificial fuel break in one location might affect the flow of current or wildfire transmission. Okay, so we're back to the duck. What this slide illustrates are our sources and our grounds. So the sources, there are 10,000 of them, all these orange dots. Think about each of those as representing a random lightning strike. So what we're doing is that's how we're injecting current into the system. We're basically going to torch the thing by burning it in 10,000 random locations. And then along the back of the duck, that blue line, that represents our sources. The idea being that we inject all this current into the landscape, and it's going to tend to flow toward that blue line. Okay, that blue line is where the current's going to leave the system. The reason we used the back of the duck is as a way to sort of represent how prevailing winds move in this landscape. So from the southwest to the northeast. Okay? So, sources, grounds, and now we need our resistance raster. Again, that's a landscape grid where every pixel has a flammability index value. Okay? And what I'm going to do is talk about some of the inputs that we used to come up with that flammability raster, that resistance raster. So we used vegetation information from land fire, so existing vegetation type, biophysical settings, succession classes, that sort of information. And then for each of those classes, we assigned a fire return interval ranging between 8 and 10,000 years. So you can imagine that an irrigated alfalfa field might have a return interval of 10,000 years. Cheatgrass might have something more like 8 or less. We also had to correct this information because this is land fire, which is a few years old. We tried to correct it using information about any fires that had burned since those data were created. We also used information that we got from USGS about the distribution or abundance of cheatgrass in the landscape. We also used something called a heat load index, which is a way to sort of consider the effects of aspect and slope and solar insolation on soil moisture, is the way you can think about it. So we combined all those different inputs to create this resistance raster, where again, each pixel has an index value assigned to it that is a measure of its flammability, okay, or its resistance to the flow of electricity. So in this case, the areas in red would have a very low resistance. They'd be the most flammable portions of the landscape. The dark green would have the highest resistance, the least flammable. Sort of cheatgrass at one end of the spectrum, irrigated alfalfa at the other. Okay, then we run the circuitscape model using those three inputs: sources, grounds, and resistance. And this is the sort of product that we get. So, this is one of our final products. The red areas on the map represent areas with high wildfire transmission or high fuel break potential, okay? So let's take a look and actually talk about these concepts. So in this case, if we were talking about wildfire likelihood, you can imagine if you had this maybe allotment of cheatgrass, okay? Locations A and B, let's say each is a 90-meter pixel, they'd have the same wildfire likelihood. You know, if lightning strikes, you know, they're going to burn equally likely. And you can see we have a LEC over here, which is, you know, really the motivation for all of this work, or sage-grouse habitat. So when we run the circuitscape model across this sort of landscape, A and B have the same wildfire likelihood. They also have the same fuel break potential. You know, if you're trying to protect this LEC, it really doesn't matter where you put your fuel break on here, all right? Now, let's make the landscape a little more complicated. Again, A and B still have the same wildfire likelihood, all right? But where would you want to put, where's the best place to put your fuel break? If you run circuitscape, and these lines that represent current density, so that's a flow of electricity, that current is getting concentrated there between the two ag fields. So even though A and B, those locations might have the same wildfire likelihood, if you're going to install a fuel break in here, the more efficient location for that fuel break might be here, where you have this at this pinch point, where it's narrow, and if you have limited funds for installing your fuel break, this might be a better spot. So, if we go back to this map, think of these red areas as places where that have higher fuel break potential. And the areas in blue would be areas where you probably shouldn't bother, either because there's maybe a lower risk of wildfire, or you'd have to make your fuel breaks really long to really make a difference. So next step, and I will mention that one of the things we did in here is included the effects of major roads as really weak fuel breaks. So that's included in this final result here. So next what we did is compared this sort of result with information about where the roads are on the landscape and different sorts of data about sage-grouse. So in this case, we're looking at breeding density data for sage-grouse. We also got LEC data from the 4 different states. And what we did, and we also had a more complete road layer to work with, was we went through and compared this and this sort of information to pick places on the landscape where we could install fuel breaks. These are just samples for demonstration. Let me talk about fuel breaks a little more, tell you more about what I mean. When I say a fuel break, it might be a green strip, it might be mowing a road, it might be a place for staging resources to stop a wildfire. And what we've done in this case to create these samples is that we digitized existing roads. We're not promoting the creation of fuel breaks through important sage-grouse habitat. We're trying to find those places on the landscape where they've already been disturbed, more or less. And so it's a better place to go in and consider doing some sort of modification to block fire. So there are 13 of these locations that we picked, again, based on information about the current density output from the circuitscape model, as well as information about where the important sage-grouse habitat is. Okay? And what we did for each of these fuel breaks is let's see if I can get this right. For each location, we inserted a fuel break, and we were able to adjust its permeability to fire. So we could make the fuel break stronger or weaker by changing, by using a multiplication factor. And so let's see if we can find a good one for you to look at. So let's watch this area here. So here's the original result. I'm sorry, that's the original result. We install that fuel break number 8 and rerun the model, and you can see how we've cooled the landscape sort of, downwind from the location of that fuel break. Okay? So in these 13 locations, we did that, and we got a sense of how the model responded when you used stronger or weaker fuel breaks. I'm just going to toggle between go through these 3. So original result, add some fuel breaks, and then we can even make those fuel breaks stronger. And yeah, so you can see how we go from a fairly red or warm landscape to something that's quite a bit cooler. Okay? And so what we've done is, just looking at this information and where we place these sample fuel breaks, is we tried to make some general recommendations about those places on the landscape where people might want to take a closer look and see if those might be good locations to consider installing fuel breaks. Now, when we started this project, in fact, I may have met some of you as we went around and visited with the different states and talked about what we were trying to do. And we had hoped to work really closely with the 4 different states in doing this project. Because we were highly motivated to at least get a finished product well before the listing decision, so this sort of tool could sort of inform the decision made by the Fish and Wildlife Service, we decided we'd turn in what we were able to complete up to that point, and then our goal now is actually to try to work closely with folks in one of these geographic areas to actually do some to do a number of things, to work at a slightly smaller spatial extent, take a closer, rerun this model with better available data, and really make some important and systematic comparisons with existing fire models, and other tools that folks are using on the ground. So, to summarize, using Circuitscape, we've come up with a GIS tool, a process that can be used to identify strategic locations for fuel breaks. We can also simulate those fuel breaks, literally adjusting their permeability to fire. And I want to emphasize that these places that we've come up with do not indicate whether a fuel break is possible, practical, or even desirable from a local perspective. We think it's really important when doing this sort of work that you've really got to zoom in. However, the tool that we're working with is really designed to work at large spatial extents. So it helps you, it's like sort of first filter you might consider. A report and some of the data we produced are available on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange site. You can take a look at that report, as well as a lot of the data we produced. Again, we're pursuing a collaboration with fire managers in one of these geographies. Right now we're hopeful for southwest Idaho, since that would be convenient, since a lot of this team is in Boise. And also we're looking for other opportunities to test and improve this approach. Want to acknowledge the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for funding this work, and ultimately the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I want to mention a couple of our local folks who were not in the modeling trenches with us, but they did help us with some of our outreach, especially Elaine York here in Utah and Jay Kirby over in Oregon. And now I'm ready for questions. So here's a nice example where we've zoomed in on one of those areas where we had really high current density, and then we've added in our fuel break and looked at the effects on current density downstream.
Plenty of time for questions for Nathan. Yep, over here.
So I was wondering, why did you use CircuitScape instead of an existing fire model? And how do you calibrate what are the inputs that go into CircuitScape?
Yeah. So he was asking about why we used CircuitScape rather than an existing fire model, and how we calibrated the results. So the answer is that because this was a novel technique, first we wanted to find out if it would work at all. And that's what we've done here, is just try to demonstrate whether it works. The arguments I've heard, and I am not a fire modeler, I'm relatively new to this, but one of the arguments, or a couple of the arguments that I've heard, is that a lot of those existing fire models are pretty data hungry and take a lot of resources, and it's hard to run those models at a landscape, at this spatial extent, across 27 million acres. Those are really models that are designed for working at smaller spatial extents. When we first talked about or proposed doing this project, they actually asked us to do this for the entire range, entire western distribution of sage-grouse. So we stepped back and said, no, we'll do it for a large area, but that's a little too much. So a lot of it had to do with just the size of the landscape we were working in. We've been very careful about our comparisons to existing fire models, especially in the language we use, because they're different. They serve different purposes. The idea here was to develop a model that be used to help identify where you might put, or where you might consider using fuel breaks as a tool. But when it comes down to it, when it comes to implementation, you're going to have to take a much closer look at that smaller spatial extent, and please go ahead and run those other fire models that we run over those spatial extents. So when it comes down to it, at this point, we haven't made any direct comparisons between the results from this model or the inputs to this model and those other tools. But we'd love to do it. We're looking for the opportunity.
When you said you strengthened the fire breaks, is that just apply for that?
No, all the fuel. He's asking how we strengthened the fuel breaks. We, made them more or less permeable. All the fire breaks that we created, because this is a 90-meter raster we were working with, fuel breaks were only 90 meters wide. They were a pixel wide. But what we were able to do is we could select the pixels that made up that fuel break, okay, and we could multiply those pixel values by just a scalar, just a multiplication factor, and we could change the size of that factor to affect how permeable they were. There was a presentation that my boss gave that talked about some of this a year ago. And one of the challenges that he talked about, because this is electricity, this is different. We're thinking about electrical circuits here. One of the challenges we've had is that if you increase the strength of the fuel break too much, it actually starts sucking in current from all over the landscape. So you end up having fires, or what it looks like is this whole area turns red, and things start flowing back into the fuel break. So there are a lot of details to be worked out as far as how well this works, if it works, how well it represents fire on the landscape, and a lot of these we just don't have good answers about how to deal with these sensitivities. Other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.